Hi, my name is Kate Zambreno. I am so honored to be here in conversation with Hiroko Oyamada. We'll be talking today about her 3 beautiful books that have been translated into the English by David Boyd and published by New Directions. And Mari Morimoto will be interpreting for us. I wanted to start off, Hiroko, asking you about the publishing history of Weasels in the Attic and its relationship to the whole, because you started telling me a little bit about it, and it's making me, and then we'll have some time for a reading as well. We'll make sure to have some time for Hiroko to read.
アナとのとか工場とのつながりについて簡単に話していただけますか。わかりました。はい。
Hello everyone, thank you for coming. I'm Hiroko Oyamada. I'm from Hiroshima, Japan. アメリカ英語版でこの3冊出ている3冊目の Weasels in the Attic という本は実は日本では出版をされていない本になります。というのは日本で1冊目の本工場と2冊目の本穴に同時収録されている短編だけを3作集めたものが英語版のイタチになっています。
So actually, in terms of this, my third book that has been translated and published in the U.S., it doesn't actually exist as its own title in Japan. In fact, it's comprised of 3 short stories, one from The Factory, which is my first book. So even though there's a factory book, that's just one of the stories in the Japanese edition. And 2 stories from my second book, Ana, or The Whole, which again is a single story in the English, but is a collection of stories. But it's comprised and becomes Weasels in the Attic.
How do you think of these stories differently, to think of them, because reading it reads to me like a triptych of masculinity and thinking through marriage. How does it make you feel differently about the relationship between these characters and works, to think of them together in one edition?
この英語版ではその3つのつながった同じ登場人物のお話が1つの本に集められてどう思われますか？特にやっぱりテーマ的にはその男性の視線からの視線とあと結婚と夫婦関係のお話ですごく英語版ではすごいスムーズな流れなんですけど、小山さん自身はこの3つが一緒の本に集められてどう思われますか？
すごく重要なご指摘で、というのは本当は日本でもこの3作が1冊の本になることができたら一番良かったんですけれども、日本の出版のやり方というか、だいたい1冊の本にどれくらいの長さの話を入れるかっていうことを考えたときに、本当は私は工場にイタチが入っている3つを全部入れてほしかったんです。というかちょっと細かい話をしてもいいですか？一回ここでやってますよ。
So actually, you bring up a very important point because I feel that perhaps it would have been best to include all 3 of these stories in one book in Japan as well. But it's just the way that books are published in Japan, there's a lot of attention paid to how short or long each of the short stories within a book should be. And originally I wanted this story about the weasels in the factory.
なんですけど、実は私はこの工場がデビュー作、工場っていうか、中編のノベラがデビュー作なんですけど、それを書いてもう一つ中編を書いたんですね。ここまでとても早く書くことができたんです。デビューして次の作品でもその次を書くことがとても難しくって、編集者と何度もやり取りをしても、ボツというダメ掲載できないダメになるっていうことが続いて、本当は私は工場と同じぐらいの長さのものを書くべきだったんです。
So actually, the factory, the story itself was my debut work. And the middle story as well, the two of them I wrote in very quickly in quick succession. So, but the third story took a really long time, and in fact, my editor kept saying, "No, no, you gotta fix it, you gotta fix it, you gotta fix it."
The third story of the factory?
工場の中の3編目が結構長くかかったんですけど。
だからいやそれはすぐ日本語版の工場の3作目はすぐ書けた2作目なんです実は。
So actually, the third story within Factory itself, in the Japanese edition, I did write quickly. じゃあ長くかかったのがどれなんですか？
それで本当は長いものを書かなきゃいけなかったのに、私は自分の書く喜びのためだけに短い小説を書いて、編集者がもっと長いものだって言っているのに勝手に送りつけたんです。それがディスカスキー、日本語のタイトルがディスカスキーの短編だったんですね。
Actually, so it's actually the middle story in Factory, which is the death in the family story, which my editor, it was supposed to be just as long as the other two, but I was so enthralled with the writing process that I wrote it really quickly as a shorter story, the way it is. And even though I had been told to write a longer one, I just submitted it.
そしたらそれが非常に評判が良かったんです。新聞で好意的なレビューが出たりして、でそれによって私は次の作品を、それが穴なんですけど、書くなんていうんですかね、弾みがついたんですね。もしこの短編ディスカスキーを書いていなくて、もっと長いものを書かなければと思っていたら、私はもしかしたら書けなくなっていたかもしれないと思っていて。
So the funny thing is when the Death in the Family came out, it got a lot of good reviews in the newspaper. So it almost led to the momentum that led to the book. And if I had actually stuck to what my editor had told me about producing a longer story, I may have ended up with writer's block and not been able to continue.
I'm so amazed by your work, its economy, its lightness in a way, and the audacity of its shortness. But also, there's nothing that should be written more. It's everything that it needs to be. It feels so daring to have a work that short. Is that more of what you're encouraged by your editor in Japan, or is your shortness also a sort of shock when they came out in Japan, when these works came out?
印象としてはその短さが魅力である。特になんかこれほど短いお話だけどもっと長くなってもいいことではないお話を書く勇気っていうのはやっぱり編集者からの指示とかあったんですか？それとも自分の中から見つけ出したものですか？
それはもう自分の中からで、私は今はもう短いものを書くことがほとんどなんですね。ショートストーリーばっかり書いているんですけど、だから私は本当の自分の呼吸ですねとしては明らかに短いものが合っているんですね。ただ日本でデビューするためにはある程度長さがあるものを書かないとデビューする窓口がないので、最初は長いものをもちろん書いてたんですけど、本当は短いものが好きなんだっていうのに気づくことができたのが、ディスカスキーでそのディスカスキーが評判が良かったので、編集者があれの続きであるとか同じようなフォーマットのものを書かないかっていうことで、ウィズルズにアーティックに収録されている他の作品を書くこともできたんですね。なんですけど彼らの都合でそれを一冊の本にすることはちょっとできなくて別れてしまった。だから本当は英語版のこの形が本来の作成の気持ちとしてはフィットしてるんですね。
So in terms of me, I would say that the what you call audacity or the format of the shorter story is who I am at heart. And right now, that's pretty much all I write is shorter stories. I feel like that's my writing rhythm or my writing style. And the only problem is in Japan, it's very difficult, if not almost impossible, to debut as a writer without writing something longer. And that's why I felt that at the time I had to. But I did realize while I was writing Death in the Family that this is who I am, this is what I want to do. And thankfully it was got such good reviews that my editor's like, oh, okay, if you want to write similar stories, similar length, let's go with that. But unfortunately, they weren't able to put that out in a single book. So we kind of split ways. And so I think, if I could do whatever I wanted, those 3 stories would have appeared in a single volume like it did in the English. But unfortunately, that didn't end up happening in Japan.
Thinking about the idea of the audaciously short book, or the short story being its own work, reminds me of the Argentinian writer Cesar Era, who New Directions also publishes in translation. And Cesar Era has said that when he is writing his books, it's like a flight forward. He doesn't look back. Do you look back a lot when you're writing, or do you kind of, from what I've read about your process, it feels like there's a dream or a moment or an image, and then you kind of take off from that and move forward.
で、自分としては似た作者がいて、小説家がいて、それはアルゼンチンのセザー・エラといって、彼もニューディレクションズが出版してるんですけど、彼はインタビューとかで自分はいつも前向きにしか書いてない、絶対一度も振り向かないとおっしゃってるんですけど、小山さんはどうですか？振り返ることってあります？それともやっぱりある一瞬、ある夢、ある映像、イメージをふっと浮かんでそのまま前に進むんですか？それとも振り返って常に前向き、後ろ向きをやってるような書き方をされるんですか？
書くときに。
はい。
そうですね。私はいつも常にこれは必ずなんですけど、一番書く最初の第一歩、最初の芽が出る種の部分っていうのは常に現実に私が見たものとか体験したこととか、もっと小さい嗅いだ匂いとか踏んだ何かの感触とか、そういう現実にあった何かっていうものが常にスタートになります。でそのことを私は思い出してできるだけ詳しく書きたいと思っているんですけど、それだとも日記などと同じですよね。なんですけど、あったことを振り返って思い出していると、ある地点からなかったことを思い出し始めるんです。それが私の書き方なんですね。
So, in terms of my writing process, what could be what I would consider my first step, or the seed that then sprouts into the story, is something that I actually saw or experienced, even something as small as a fragrance or smell, aroma that I smelled, or the sensation of stepping on a certain thing. And then, I say, okay, I want to be able to recall that sense, whatever it was, and be able to write it down in exquisite detail. It's almost like writing a diary, writing an entry in a diary. But it's also something that taking something that doesn't necessarily exist, but I want to make that into reality. でいいんですか？
そうですね。そうだから前に向かって書くことが自分の中にあるなかった過去を振り返りながら新しい過去を想像し続けているっていう意味で、だから前向きか後ろ向きかっていうとちょっとどっちが正解かわからないけど、書き方は常になかったことを思い出しながら書いているっていう感じです。
So I feel that it's really difficult to answer the am I forward looking or backward looking, because I am writing forward, but I'm writing about a past that wasn't necessarily there. It might be based on a real moment or real experience, but I then embellish upon it to something that wasn't necessarily there at the time.
I love, even thinking about the idea of flight is reminding me of what I've read, is that the original, and maybe you could say if this is true or not, I believe it was David Boyd, your translator, who wrote this in an essay, that it was the kind of slight hallucination of a printer cartridge actually being a bird wing, that is what was the original image in the factory.
でこれは本当かどうかわかんないですけど英訳をしたデイビッド・ボイドがエッセイで書かれたのがそのなんか自分の印刷機のカートリッジが鳥の翼とふと幻想を見た感覚から工場のお話が出来上がったって書いてあるんですけどそれは本当なんですか？
はい、そうですね。で、私は本当に大きい会社の印刷部門の近くで働いていたことがあって、最初はその働いていることがとても辛いっていうことをちょっとセラピーみたいな感じで、あまりに辛くて書かないと狂ってしまいそうだったので書いていたんですけど、でもそれはあくまでも自分のためで小説にはならなかったんですね。でも偶然職場にいる小柄な女の人が大きい機械の部品を持ち上げているところを後ろから見たら、機械の部品が肩からはみ出して一瞬彼女に翼が生えたように見えたんです。何か悪のヒーローみたいな。ですぐにそれを見間違いだって分かったんですけど、その一瞬鳥に見えたっていうことを書くことで、私が今まで自分のために書いていたセラピーが小説になるっていうのをその時確信したというか予感したんですね。だからデイビッドが言ってることは正しい。
So it's actually true after a sense because at the time when I got the inspiration to write Factory, I was working for a very big company near the printing department. There was an incident, and I found it very tough and challenging. So I was actually writing about it almost therapeutically. But because I was doing this for myself as therapy, I didn't think it would actually be able to stand alone as a novel. However, there was this one moment where I saw this rather small-framed woman trying to lift up a very big piece of printing equipment, and I saw her from behind. But the sides of it was such a long piece of equipment that both sides kind of jutted out to either side of her, and for a moment it looked like she had wings, almost like an anti-hero. And that's when I said, "Oh, wow, that I could write this as a novel." And so, in that sense, what David Boyd said was actually true.
In the work on tone that Sophia Samantar and I wrote together, we write about You're the Factory, and when we read that it was inspired by a toner cartridge, we went into ecstasy. Like toner cartridge. It felt like it was like a very magical moment for us. This like very strange coincidence to think of tone and then also like toner, printing toner, like this very mechanical thing in which one writes with.
で自分たちもそのトーンというエッセイを書いた時にその印刷の用のインクが入ってるカートリッジは英語ではトーナーカートリッジというので、そのトーンとトーナーの本当もうギャグ的なその偶然にびっくりしてすごい興奮しました。
そういう本当は何の関係もないかもしれない偶然みたいなものによって作品や誰か書き手に引き寄せられるように感じることは確かによくありますよね。
I can definitely relate that you see these seemingly unrelated objects or experiences suddenly coming together. I feel that happens a lot to me as well. It provides seeds for more stories and so forth.
When I think of your work, I think so much of tone and so much of atmosphere, and I'm wondering how you think about that with your own work. Now, I'm imagining the translations are different than the original, but there's such to me a very specific tone that is so much about the characters and how they exist in this space together, and that sense of togetherness as well as apartness. So I'm curious, when you're writing your work, do you think of tone or do you think of atmosphere, and how do you think of it?
そのお話ある程度多少はその英訳版ともともと 小山さんが書かれた日本語版との、微妙な違いもあると思うんですけど、大山さんはその雰囲気のことをどれぐらい気づきながら意識しながら書かれるんですか？特にその登場するキャラクターの関係性とか絆とかに関して。
なるほど、そうですね。作品の雰囲気とか空気っていうものは小説においては詰まるところ言葉のリズムとか呼吸じゃないのかなというのを一番最初に考えたんですけど、私の書く小説は常に一人称なんですね。私あるいは僕、俺というような視点から語るものばかり基本的には書いていて、そうなるとその作品の空気を作るのはその視点人物が何に目が行くのか、何を聞くのか、何を嗅ぐのかみたいな、その視点人物の五感の向いている方を私がきちんと定めることができれば正しい空気が作れてその小説は成功する。一方で彼女が何を見ているのか、何に気づくのか書きながら分からなくなる時があって、書きたいことは決まっているのに彼が何に注目するのかわからない、そういう時はその小説はうまくいかないことが多いですね。
So I feel that in terms of tone or atmosphere, there's a certain kind of rhythm I feel that I need to maintain in writing, which is almost like the breath rate or the respiration of that work. But fundamentally, I almost always write in the first person perspective. That's a given. And so it's always based on that character whose first person perspective the story is taking, what they see, what they do, what they notice, even what they smell. And I have to be able to see in my own head and decide what that is, and then set it down on paper in a way that the reader would understand. And that's what determines how successful that story is. And of course, there are times when I lose sight of that, and I stop realizing what that character would notice based on who that character is, whether it's a male character or female character. And if I lose sight of what their focus is, that's when the story flounders.
It's remarkable to me how you write male characters. And I think of Weasels and Attic as it's published in the English as in so many ways. It's a study of friendship between men. It's a study of like alienation of this very traditional ideas of heterosexual marriage. And it's a study of masculinity. And what I find incredibly remarkable about your work, in The Factory, it's two male characters, one woman character, I believe, as the main point of views. And in Weasels in the Attic, we all get just the male first person. You find a way, and I don't know anyone else who does this, well, you will write the atmosphere of patriarchy, and you write men who are in some ways repulsive, but then it's also incredibly compassionate and tender. And I'm wondering how you think about these characters that you embody. I don't know if I can think of any other woman writer who's writing a first-person male character in this way.
特に Weasels ではその男性のキャラクターの間の友情とか、あとその伝統的といったらおかしいかもしれませんけど、日本社会、どの社会でもその異性関係がだんだん優れていく夫婦の間の関係性とかで、あとその男らしさ、その女性の小説家としてそういうなんか男性の視線からのお話書くのはすごくもう本当小山さんぐらいしかうまくできてないと思うんですけど、でもちろんその工場ではその女性キャラクターからの視線もありましたけど、Weasels のお話3つともその男性の視線から書いてあるんですけど、 本当にそれもなんか好きになれないキャラクターが多いような気があるんですけど、それについてちょっと触れてもらえますか。
はい、そうですね。基本的に一人称で書くので、スタートとしては女性の語り手視点になることが本当は自然なんです、私にとっては。なんですけど、これは一つ法則じゃないんですけど、このウィーゼルズに入っている小説っていうものは基本的には全部ベースには子供を産むこと、あるいは産まないこと、産めないことっていうものが基本的には全てつながっています。で、この話題を書くときに女性の語り手として自分が産む、自分が産まない、自分が産めないっていうことの語り手にすると、私はその時ちょっとうまく書けなかったんですね。非常に例えば悲劇的になるとか過剰にシニカルになるっていうようなことになってしまって、なんですけど、それを自分も当事者であるにもかかわらず、あたかも傍観者であるかのように語る男性を通してその女性を書くことによって、そこにある、そうですね、マスキュリンな部分の良くないところ、過不調性の間違っているところが逆説的に書くことができる。これ女性から告発する形で書くと非常に私の呼吸にはちょっとなかなか合いにくいので、出産や妊娠がテーマだからこそ男性を語り手にしている必要があったんだと思ってます。
So of course, identifying as a woman myself, it's very natural for me to want to write and to write from a female perspective, to write a female character. As I said, I write in the first person perspective, so it's easier to. But even though it's not necessarily a hard rule, the three stories in Weasel of the Attic, in addition to what you already mentioned, one of the underlying themes is this whole concept of having childbearing.
Yeah.
To bear a child, not to bear a child, not able to bear a child, infertility, fertility and infertility. And, you know, even though the woman, and I as a woman, and the one who would bear a child or not bear a child, or may not be able to bear a child, I somehow had trouble trying to write it from a female perspective. And I felt like it would end up having too tragic of a tone, or even like maybe a cynical tone. So I felt that it actually was necessary to present the female perspective from a male point of view. And even though the characters may not be likable, or they might have mistaken patriarchal concepts, it was much easier to do that than to write from a female perspective, where it would seem like I'm making some sort of self-proclamation.
And also, it alludes how you are read to refuse that identification with the first person. Right? It's a wonderful sort of illusion that this is not me.
あとその読者が読んで、だけどその作者が女性なのに男性のキャラクターだと、どうそのお話を取り上げるかも変わってくるんですよね。やっぱりその男性キャラクターでしたら。
そうですね、そういうところもあるかもしれませんね。でもおそらく私の意図は日本語においてはかなり伝わっているんじゃないかなと思います。みんなこの彼ら男性たちの態度が女性に対してひどいであるとか、資料が足りない、考えが足りないであるとかっていうふうに思いますが、多分これを私が女性側から彼らを糾弾するトーンで書いていたら、ある種のコミカルさであるとか、読むときにこう推進させる力、ページをページをめくらせる力っていうのは確実に弱くなっている。それは書き手によって持っている武器が違っていて、私はその告発であるとか怒りっていうものを作品にするのはあまり得意じゃない。思いはすごくあっても、そう私はケイトさんのヒロインズをとても面白く読みましたけれど、ここには明らかに怒りであるとかその問題意識っていうものが推進力になっていると感じた。でもそのスタイルが私とは違う。で、私はそこにそういうちょっと浮いた視点から、男性の浮いた視点を取り入れることによって逆にそこに真実味を出すことができると思っていて、でも日本では 女性が男性の語り手で書くことはそんなに珍しくないと思って、あんまり英語圏ではなされないんですかね。
Well, in terms of what the part you mentioned about what the readers might pick up from that kind of point of view or that kind of writing style, I feel that in Japan itself, my intent is picked up very accurately. In fact, you know, they can say, oh, these men, their attitude are terrible, they don't think enough about their female partners, they're not sympathetic enough. But I feel that it's because I'm writing from that male perspective. I think that it wouldn't be as comical or give the reader more impetus to keep turning the pages if I was writing from a female character's perspective, where I'm just criticizing them and nagging them about their terrible attitudes. In fact, like, I feel that each gender has their respective strengths but also weapons. And if it was written from a female perspective, all you get is that rage or the self-confession or self-proclamation. And I don't feel that I'm very good at expressing that. In fact, one of the things that impresses me about your book, Heroines, is that there's self-awareness of one's own issues, and you can clearly see the anger there. But I feel that that's because we have different styles of writing. I don't think I could actually do that, accomplish that myself. But in terms of it being rare for a female writer to portray the male perspective as accurately as you say that I do, I don't think that's unusual in Japan. I feel, I'm actually curious, would that be considered unusual here in the US?
No, I don't think it's unusual. I do definitely think that I'm trying to think of names of, there's many women writers who write male characters that I'm just blanking on right now, but there are a lot. It feels like you're doing something, and I would love to hear you, because I know that you were going to read a little bit as well. But it just feels like you're doing something kind of slyly subversive with the tradition of the Japanese I novel. That there's obviously this first person that is in a way diaristic, although it leans towards the strange or surreal, but you play with our expectations as a reader.
じゃあアメリカでもそんなに珍しくはないと思うんですけど、ただ小山さんの独特さといえば自分の第一者の視線から書く中でなんかちょっと派法的な面がある印象なんですね。だからそこがちょっと他の作者と違うんじゃないかと思うんですね。
でも常に間違いないのは、私が男性の視点で書いているときは女性を書きたいんです。女性を書くために男性の視点を書いている。これが一番大きな理由だと思いますね。
The one thing though that I want to make sure everyone understands though is that when I'm writing from a male perspective, when I'm writing as a male character, it's because I want to write about women. I don't want to just present the male perspective of being a man. I'm actually trying to reflect back on women and femininity through the male character's point of view.
Yeah, I think that's what makes Weasels and Addicts so magnetic, is that there is that space of empathy, but there's also this gap of non-recognition that the husbands often feel for the wives, and in some ways it feels in that way like the inverse of the whole, where we're almost getting the husband in the whole and his perspective on moving to the country, on the isolation of the new bride, of the wife character.
だからWeasels に関してはやっぱり共感っていうか、共感でありながら主人と奥さんの間のギャップ、どうしてもつなげられないギャップがあることがアナとまた反対の印象がありますね。なんかアナは女性のキャラクター、奥さんのキャラクターからの視線なんだけど、 その旦那自身がその田舎に引っ越してその田舎の孤独さを反映してるんじゃないかと思います。
男性の方が、
はい
その部分もあるかもしれません。そうただ穴について言うと男性は実は故郷に帰っただけなんですね。彼にとってあの奇妙な世界は実はホームグラウンドなんですよね。なんですが妻である語り手にとってはそこは完全にほぼ未知な土地であって、だからこそ彼女はその場所のおかしさ狂いというようなものに対面し続けなきゃいけないけど、夫にとってそれはもうただの背景に過ぎない。でそこにはやっぱ男女の間の決して埋まらない夫婦の間の満たされない違いみたいなものが出てるんだと思います。
So that might be true, and yet the other thing to recognize in the whole is that the husband is simply going home. He's going back to where he grew up. So even though it's a weird world, it's one that he's comfortable with because that's all he knew growing up. And yet for the wife, this is completely unknown territory. She's a stranger in a strange land, or a stranger in a stranger land. And so she's always butting up against the weirdness and the things that are just off in a way that she can't describe. And that also kind of highlights this gap between the husband and wife that can't be filled, that can't ever be brought together.
I have lots more things to ask you, but would you like to read a little bit
ちょっと
from?
朗読します。
あ、そうですね。じゃあ少し朗読をしましょう。I read the beginning of short story in this book. Japanese title is いたちなく。この正月は妻の実家へは帰らなかった。いいのよ、妻は肩をすくめた。私が一人で暇な時に行けばいいのよ、そんなに遠くないんだし。実際妻はたびたび一人で里に帰っていた。僕としてもどうしても義父母や妻の妹一家と顔を合わせたいわけでもない。ゆうちゃんたちのお年玉だけ母にことづけしておくわ。そうかい。三が日も過ぎ、職場の正月休みもとうに終わった頃に友人の佐伯くんから牙城が来た。干支の絵が印刷された年賀はがきにボールペンの殴り書きで、引っ越して住所が変わった。年末年始大変な忙しさ。なお当方結婚いたし候。相手は32歳なりとあった。わざわざ奥さんの名前を書くところが佐伯くんらしい。32歳となると10近くも年下ということになる。新居の住所は市内から車で1時間ほどの兼業農家が多い地区で、後ろには中国産地が控えている。引っ越して欠陥者となったら随分な変化である。僕は佐伯くんに電話をかけた。やあやあ、どうもどうも。佐伯くんは大きな声で出た。牙城いただいたよ、おめでとう。結婚したなんてすごいじゃないか。ああ、大回転だったよ。家をね、築50年の家を買ってね、リフォームしたんだよ。酔っているような口調だった。仕事関係に周知している間に友達諸君への連絡が遅れて、こんな風に年賀はがきで知らせる都合になってしまって申し訳ないんだが。佐伯君は自宅でする仕事をしている。なんだか舌が唇にぶつかるような喋り方で、その後ろからわーわーと人が騒いでいるような声も聞こえていた。宴会仲介？宴会なんて上品なものじゃない。田舎の寄り合いさ。俺は都会育ちだから、こういうところはどうも馴染め。金魚の暇な親父どもが集まってきて、夜な夜な酒を飲むんだ。いろいろと失敗した。失敗したと言いながら楽しそうだった。だいぶ飲んでいるようだった。結婚したのはおめでたいことじゃないか。まあね、40過ぎて初婚だからちょっと自分でも妙な気分だが悪くない。今のところは。時に奥さんは元気かい？ああ。妻は最近あまり元気そうに見えない。仕事で疲れてもいるのだろうし、不妊のことが気にかかっているのかもしれない。妻もおかげさまで元気だよ。宴会だか寄り合いだか、あまりお邪魔しちゃ悪いから切るよ。とにかくおめでとう。少し前だったか、僕が帰宅すると、トトトッと音がして、妻が迎えに出てきた。妻と一緒に米の炊ける甘い匂いがした。ああ、ただいま。ねえ。妻は妙に真剣な顔をしていた。何かあったのかと思って僕も真顔になった。どうしたの？ねえ、妻は珍しく言いよどんだ。妻もまだスーツを着ていて、仕事帰りすぐのようであった。 片手に丸いものを持っていた。直径が5センチくらいの半透明の白いプラスチックで、皮膚科でクリームをもらう時の蓋付きの容器に似ていた。ね、あなたは最近でも自分でしたりするの？自分で？僕は面食らって妻の顔を見た。何をだい？なんていうのかしら。妻はその手のひらに乗った容器を見た。いつの間にか薄笑いを浮かべていた。つまり自分で自分のものを妻の顔を次にハッとした。もしかしてその自分で手や何かでするそれかい？ええ。妻はうなずいた。僕はドギマギとした。赤面もしたようだった。このくらいで。
The last of the Weasels. We didn't visit my wife's family for New Year's. It's fine, she said, shrugging her shoulders. I'll go on my own when I have time. It's not that far away. From time to time, she did go back home without me. For my part, I saw no real reason to see my wife's parents or my sister-in-law's family. I'll just ask Mom to give the kids a little something from us. Sounds good, if you're sure. The holidays came and went. I'd already been back at work for a while when, by the time I got a New Year's card from Psyche with a picture of the year's zodiac animal printed on the front. It had a short message scribbled in ballpoint pen. Moved house, holidays were hectic, got married, bride is 32. It was just like Psyche to mention her age. 32 meant that she was about 10 years his junior. His new house was maybe an hour's drive from town, just shy of the Chuguk Mountains, in an area where many of the residents did a little farming on the side. For Psyche to get married and move into a new home like that was a big change. I figured I ought to give him a call. "Hey there," Psyche said loudly as he picked up. "How have you been?" "I just got your card. Thought I should call and say congrats. So, you're married now?" I know. I'm a new man. This house is another story, though. It's been here for 50 years, so we had to do some serious renovation." He sounded a little drunk. "Sorry to drop that on you in a card. I told some people from work, but failed to share the big news with my closest friends." Psyche worked at home. He spoke as if his tongue was getting in the way. I could hear a clamor of voices behind him. "You having a get-together or something?" No, nothing that fancy. We're way out in the country here. People just swing by. I grew up in the city, so this is all strange to me. The old guys from around the neighborhood show up night after night, raring to drink. They've got nothing but time. Anyway, I messed up. I messed up everything. "I messed up," he said, but he sounded overjoyed. He must have had a lot to drink. "But you're married now. That's cause for celebration, right?" "Well, yeah. Getting married for the first time after 40 is a little, I don't know. It feels kind of weird. Not in a bad way, though. What about you? How's the wife holding up? She doing okay?" "Yeah." She actually hadn't been that great. Her work was draining, but even more than that, I felt like not getting pregnant was really weighing on her. "She's been good. Thanks for asking. Well, get together or not, I don't want to keep you. Just wanted to call and say congrats." One day, not long before that, right when I got home, my wife rushed to meet me at the door and brought the sweet smell of rice with her. I'm home." "Hey." The look on her face was weirdly serious. I didn't know what was going on, so I mirrored her expression. "What is it?" "Well, my wife wasn't usually one to beat around the bush. She was still in her office clothes, so she couldn't have been home for very long. There was something round in her hand. It was semi-transparent white plastic, maybe 2 inches in diameter. It looked like one of those covered containers for prescription creams that you get from the dermatologist." "Have you been, handling things yourself?" "Handling things?" I stared at my wife, confused. "What things?" How can I put it? My wife looked down at the container in her hand, then broke into a faint smile. "I mean, do you ever, you know?" I was shocked by the look she was giving me. "Oh, you mean use my hand and stuff do I do that?" "Yeah." She nodded. I had no idea what to say. My face must have been bright red.
How are we doing on time? Do we still have some more time? I wanted to maybe ask if there were questions and then we could continue the conversation if there was time.
Let's do questions.
Are there any questions for Hiroko Oyamada? Do you need a mic or can you just kind of speak loudly?
How you distort nature, and especially in the factory. without pushing it so far that you're creating these fantastic beasts, you're inventing new species, it seems like. And I wondered what if it's difficult to restrain yourself from turning, say, the birds in the factory into dragons or into something much more fantastical. And then the sort of second part of that is, what effect are you looking for in the reader when you do these distortions in nature?
今までの小説とかで結構自然がちょっとに変化を起こすことがよく見られますね。特に工場で通常にある野生動物とかをもう本当なんか空想的な生き物に変えていくような感じがあるんですけど、どれぐらいもっと本当自然に起こらない動物に変身するのを自分がしようと思って、それを自分を引き止めなければいけないんですか。例えば水鳥が竜にと描きたがったりされることはありますか。そういうなんか通常の動物を変な動物に変えて読者にどういう影響を与えようとされてるんですか。
素晴らしい質問ありがとうございます。Thank you for your question. 一つさっき私が工場を書いたきっかけが鳥を見間違ったことだと言いました。実際に工場の地下室に決して大きな黒い鳥はいない。でも私はそれを見間違えることによって一瞬信じることができた。この信じるっていうことがすごく大事で、さっき私はなかったことを思い出して書くと言いました。思い出すためにはそれがあったことを信じていなければならないと思うんですけど、つまり私はそれが本当にあったと信じていることしか書きたくないんですね。で、工場に出てくる鳥については本当に一瞬見た見間違いが私を信じさせてくれて、そのことからそれがどういう理由でそこに鳥がいたのかを逆になかったことを思い出すことによって書きました。他の動物も同じですっていう、つまり自分がその信じられるディティールが見えるかどうかが非常に重要で、あともう一つ別の側面もあって、私はいろいろなその動物や植物のことを細かく書くのが好きなんですが、非常に身近な生き物や植物であってもものすごくよく見たらそれは見慣れないものに変化すると思うんです。てか自分の手だってよく見ていたらとても変なんですね。例えばシワがある、爪がある、こんな風に生えていただろうか。そういう風に現実にあるものを細かく見て細かく書くと必ずそれは奇妙な現実を超えたものに感じられる文章になるんです。だから私さっきおっしゃったじゃあ鳥が竜になるというようなことを多分私は信じないので書かないし、鳥をいくら見ても竜に見えないかもしれない。でももしかして私がある時鳥を見たらその顔が竜に見えるかもしれない。そしたら私は多分竜のことを書くでしょう。だからあくまでも私がそれを信じているか、細かく見ることができるかどうかというのがとても重要だと思っています。長くなってごめんなさい。
So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that spurred me to write the factory, inspired me to write this factory, was this image that I mistook this woman with this big piece of printing equipment for a bird. Of course, there aren't large black birds living in the basement of factories, but what was important was that for just a second, for an instant, I actually believed that it was a big black bird. And so, as I've also said, I like to write about things that I look back, things that didn't actually happen, or that may have happened but didn't happen the way they did. And so, the fact is, even though the factory was based on a mistaken impression or something that I imagined seeing that wasn't there, I then have to think about, well, what if they were there? Why would they be there? How would they be there? And if I'm able to describe it in enough detail to make myself believe that it was there, then I think I can successfully make the reader believe that they, whatever it is there as well. And to look at it from a slightly different angle, I do like writing about plants and animals in very minute detail. And what I feel personally too is that you can take everyday creatures or objects, and if you look at them closely enough, they'll transform into things that you've never seen before, or something that's very strange. For example, even your own hand. You look at your hand every day, but have you ever really inspected your hand very minutely? I mean, if you look close enough, you'll be like, oh, there are wrinkles, there are nails. Were they there before? Did they look like that before? And so I do like to put that in writing, and it ends up being these full sentences and paragraphs. And the reason why I didn't even have to restrain myself in terms of your specific question about what, did I have to restrain myself from turning the birds into dragons? I didn't do that. I didn't have to even restrain myself because I didn't think they were dragons. I wouldn't believe that they were dragons when I see them. But maybe one day there will be a story that I write in the future where something will appear as if it's a dragon, in which case there will be dragons in that story.
It strikes me that your interest in the creaturely, especially across the whole and the factory, is about the creaturely being unnamed or unknown, on the edges and blurred. There's always the mystery of the creature and whether one sees it. And that's so much part of the suspenseful, the gentle suspense of the whole and the factory, that there is a creature, but we don't know exactly how the creature is named, and to name it changes it somewhat. I thought it was really interesting in Weasels in the Attic. The creaturely is domestic. So there are weasels in the attic, there are fish. So it seems like you're writing more about sort of the creaturely that we live with in those stories.
なんか自分としては特に穴とか工場のお話には名付けられない生物、名付けられないだけでなく、なんかちょっと謎的な生き物が出てくるんですね。それがそのお話のなんか奇妙さを増すような感じなんですけど、逆にそのイタチとかそのウィーズルに出てくる生物はその名付けられた日常的に見つかる野生動物とかペットとかその魚熱帯魚またはイタチとかあるんですけど、やっぱりそれでなんか結構お話の違いが出てくるんじゃないかと思うんですよね。
それもあるかもしれません。ただやっぱり同じことが言えるのは、じゃあ熱帯魚が身近だとして熱帯魚のことを本当に見たことがあるのか、どれくらいどんな目で見ているのかっていうことがやっぱり重要で、熱帯魚のマニアで毎日カタログを見ていたらそれは詳しいかもしれないけど、でも目の前にいる魚のその状況を見るのはでもその一瞬だけですよね。そうなると無数の新しい魚がそこに存在し続けていて、いつそれを凝視しっかり見ることができるのかっていうと、それは非常に個人的でほとんど奇跡というかその時その人にしかないもので、だからそれをきちんと書けばそれは身近なものであってもその人生において特別な意味を持つと思うんです。
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because if you look at it from a different angle, even though they're certain fish and you know the species of the fish and they seem to be everyday and very close to everyday life, when have you ever really looked close at that fish or those fish? I mean, how much do you really know about the fish? Because if you are a fish enthusiast, of course you probably know all sorts of like where they came from, what their life cycle is. But if you just take anyone who is not necessarily particularly interested in fish and stuck them in front of the tank, each person would have a different perspective, their own unique way to see the fish and interpret the fish. And so I think that's and also the fish are not static. They're continuously, some are dying, there's sometimes you add new fish, sometimes they multiply. So it's always changing. And so I think that that's a special moment in time for each individual person that happens to see that fish. So I think there's still some mystery and some uniqueness to that.
Is there a more? I have more
Yeah,
things I can
time
ask.
is getting tight. We do close at 8, so maybe one more.
One more question, and I can repeat it if so everyone can hear it. If there aren't any.
ありがとうございます。ちょっと子供っぽい質問かもしれませんが、小説家になってから人生に重大ななんかレッスンとかできたんでしょうか。
So the question is, this might be a slightly childish question, but ever since you started being a professional writer, were there any life lessons or anything that you've learned that influenced your writing? そのお話とかプロセスに影響されたなんか重大な人生のなんかすごい象徴的な事件とかありましたでしょうか。
作品の中でじゃなく私の人生ですね。
Her life lessons that may be reflected in the story. そうです。自分自身に行った
とてもいい質問だと思います。ありがとうございます。私はずっと大学を卒業して普通に就職して、だから工場とかいろんなところで働いたんですけど、どこもうまくいかなかったんですね。私はいつも真面目にやってるんだけど、なぜかいつもうまくいかなくって結局辞めてしまう。でそれがすごく私はコンプレックスだったんですけど、それを癒すために小説を書き始めたのがきっかけで、それがデビューすることができて本になった時に、私が今までうまくいかなかったのは、例えばその時に必要な情報じゃないものをものすごく見たり考えたりしてしまう。例えばボスが私に指示をしているのにボスのヒゲのことばっかり見てしまう。なんで奇妙なヒゲなんだろうと思ってる。そういうことをしていると仕事はうまくいかないんですね。でもそれは小説を書くときにそのカードはひっくり返ってとても強い私のいい手札になったんですね。小説を書くことでそれまで私のそれは社会において間違っているとされていた視点が小説家としては私の特性に変わった。それが私にとって一番大きな変化で、だから本当に小説を書くことに気づいてよかったなというふうに思っています。
So, it's actually a great question. After I graduated from university, I actually worked several different jobs in succession, including a factory, but it never worked out. And, I would work very hard, I'd take the job seriously, but somehow I'd end up quitting. And it kind of really took me down, like I was feeling really blue. And so I started writing, as I said, almost as therapy to work everything out and to heal myself. And then, I managed to debut as a writer. What happened was that back when I was working, I'd keep seeing or thinking about things that wasn't necessarily related directly to the work I was doing. And that was what was causing a problem or what was seen as a negative. Which is, for example, to give a specific example, I'd be getting feedback, maybe even being criticized by my superior, and all I could focus on was his facial hair, and going, wow, I've never seen facial hair like that before. I wonder how he gets it to look the way it does. Things that people would say is a mistake. Like you're supposed to be focusing on the feedback and to improve yourself and to improve your work, and yet, as a writer, this proved the best fodder for my stories. And so I'm really glad I found this calling as a writer, because everything that everyone around me considered my weaknesses actually led to me being a better and strong writer.
Well, thank you to Mary Morimoto and especially to Hiroko Oyamada. I believe there's going to be a signing now. And also, you really need all three books, so keep something. They really fit together.
Thank you. Thank you, Kate.